In a world where unexpected alliances can redefine the balance of power, a surprising piece of news has echoed through the corridors of international diplomacy. 700 North Korean commandos have landed on African soil to protect President Ibrahim Traoré. What led to this unlikely union? Get ready for a story of intrigue, survival, and the surprising twists and turns of geopolitics. If you are fascinated by narratives that explore the limits of sovereignty and the most unusual alliances, consider subscribing to our channel to follow every detail of this and other impactful stories. The harsh West African sun beat down on the remote airstrip just a few kilometers from the capital Ouagadougou, raising a fine dust that blurred vision and clung to the skin like a second layer. Amidst almost absolute secrecy, broken only by the distant hum of a few strategically positioned military vehicles, an unmarked transport plane, a model rarely seen in those parts, taxied slowly after a flawless landing, defying the precarious conditions of the runway. The tension in the air was palpable, denser than the heat itself, because what was about to disembark from that aircraft was something that few intelligence analysts would have dared to predict. The plane's rear ramp began to descend with a metallic groan, revealing rows and rows of men in unfamiliar dark olive-green uniforms, their impassive Asian features and a discipline that exuded from their every calculated movement. They were the legendary North Korean Commandos, an elite force shrouded in mystery and known for their fanatical loyalty and their ability to operate in the most adverse conditions. 700 of them, a considerable force, were on Burkina soil. Not as invaders, but surprisingly as protectors, sent on a secret mission to ensure the safety of President Ibrahim Traoré. Traoré's decision to accept Pyongyang's offer had been made after weeks of intense deliberation and amid a growing awareness that the threats to his life and rule were becoming increasingly sophisticated and dangerous, orchestrated by external and internal enemies determined to silence his voice and reverse his nationalist policies. The destabilization attempts, the uncovered plots, and the relentless economic pressures meant that his adversaries would not hesitate to use any means necessary to remove him from power, and he needed an impenetrable shield. The traditional Western powers that had once offered security cooperation were now viewed with deep suspicion, many of them being the same ones that were secretly working to undermine his government. Entrusting his protection to them would be like handing the keys to the henhouse to the fox. He needed allies who had no colonial interests in Africa, who shared, if for different reasons, an antagonism toward the same hegemonic powers that threatened him and who possessed proven military capabilities and absolute discretion. North Korea unexpectedly met these requirements. The first contacts were made through discreet diplomatic channels in third countries, far from the prying eyes of international espionage. The North Korean proposal, initially received with surprise and a certain hesitation by Traoré's inner circle, was straightforward: to offer a contingent of its best special forces to act as a Praetorian Guard, a personal protection and rapid response unit, loyal only to the president and capable of deterring any coup or assassination attempt, whether from within or without. The political risk of such an alliance was enormous. North Korea was a pariah state for much of the international community, isolated by sanctions and known for its authoritarian rule. Partnering with Pyongyang could alienate potential African allies, provide more ammunition for Western smear campaigns, and further complicate Burkina Faso's already strained international relations. But for Traoré, the survival of his project and his very life were at stake. And in desperate times, desperate or at least unexpected, measures become viable options. The negotiation of the terms of the agreement was secretive and complex. The North Koreans were not asking for direct financial resources, but rather for stronger diplomatic recognition, possible cooperation agreements in other areas in the future, and, above all, the opportunity to project their influence and demonstrate their military capabilities in a new theater of operations, challenging the isolation imposed by the West. For them, it was a bold geopolitical move, a way to show that they were still a relevant player on the world stage, capable of forming surprising alliances. The arrival of the Commandos was planned with military precision. They brought their own equipment, their own weapons and even their own initial supplies to minimize logistical dependence and ensure the secrecy of the operation. Their integration into Traoré's security system would be gradual, but their presence alone sent a powerful and unequivocal message to his enemies. The president of Burkina Faso was no longer alone, and any attempt against him would meet fierce and highly skilled resistance. The few highly trusted Burkinabe officers who were aware of the operation watched the landing with a mixture of apprehension and admiration. The discipline and readiness of the North Koreans was impressive, in contrast to the informality often seen in some local units. There was an aura of mystery and danger surrounding these silent men, but also a sense that perhaps they were the reassurance the president needed to continue his fight for sovereignty. As the last crew disembarked and the plane's ramp closed, the sun began to set, dyeing the Ouagadougou sky in shades of red and orange. Her new and unlikely alliance had been sealed in those African lands, an alliance born of necessity and geopolitics, which promised to redefine the rules of the game and send shockwaves through the corridors of power in distant capitals. The world didn't know it yet, but Ibrahim Traoré's shield had just gained an unexpected and formidable reinforcement, coming from the most unlikely place on the planet. The news of the presence of North Korean commandos in Burkina Faso, although initially kept absolutely secret, began to leak out gradually, first as whispers in diplomatic and intelligence circles, then as unconfirmed rumors in alternative media, until it finally exploded like a bomb in international headlines, provoking a storm of reactions ranging from incredulity to alarm and vehement condemnation on the part of Western powers. President Ibrahim Traoré had once again managed to shock the world with an audacious and completely unexpected geopolitical move, defying all conventions. In Washington, Paris, and Brussels, the reaction was one of shock and deep concern. The idea of an African leader, already considered problematic and out of line, seeking protection from a pariah regime like North Korea, was seen not only as an act of defiance, but as a dangerous escalation that could further destabilize the already fragile Sahel region. Security analysts were poring over the possible motives and implications of this unusual alliance, trying to decipher Traoré's strategy and Pyongyang's true intentions in this new and unexpected theater of operations. Accusations that Traoré was allying himself with one of the world's most repressive regimes to protect himself from his own people or to suppress internal opposition were immediately heard, fueled by those who saw an opportunity to further discredit the Burkinabe leader. This conveniently ignored the context of the growing external and internal threats he faced, many of them fomented by the same powers that were now criticizing him. The Western narrative quickly shaped him as a desperate tyrant willing to do anything to hold on to power. However, in other parts of the world, especially among nations that also felt they were the target of hegemonic pressures or that sought greater autonomy in relation to the West, the reaction was more nuanced and, in some cases, even veiled admiration for Traoré's audacity. For these countries, the alliance with North Korea, however controversial it was seen as an act of sovereignty, a demonstration that he would not bow to pressure and would seek the necessary means to guarantee his security and that of his country, even if that meant resorting to unconventional partners. Within Burkina Faso, the news also sparked intense debate, although it was largely muted by Traoré's popularity and the perception that the country was under siege. Many citizens, tired of instability and coup attempts, saw the arrival of the North Koreans as a drastic but perhaps necessary measure to ensure peace and the continuation of promised reforms. There was, however, a segment of the population and the intellectual elite who expressed concern about the long-term implications of such an alliance for the country's image and international relations. President Traoré, aware of the diplomatic storm his decision had unleashed, did not back down. In an address to the nation, he defended his choice as an act of self-defense in the face of real and proven threats to Burkina Faso's sovereignty and security. He argued that if the powers that claimed to be defenders of democracy and human rights were genuinely concerned about the well-being of the Burkinabe people, they should cease their attempts at destabilization and respect the country's right to choose its own partners and its own path. He also made sure to emphasize that the presence of North Korean commandos was strictly for personal protection and training of local security forces, not to repress the population or to meddle in internal affairs. It was an attempt to calm fears and control the narrative by presenting the move as a defensive necessity rather than an ideological alliance with the Pyongyang regime, a distinction crucial to maintaining domestic support and understanding among some international partners. Meanwhile, the 700 North Korean commandos, oblivious to the diplomatic storm that their arrival had provoked, began to quietly integrate themselves into the president's security apparatus. Their main base was established in a military complex on the outskirts of the capital, far from prying eyes but with ready access to the presidential palace and other strategic locations. They operated with considerable autonomy, but in coordination with a small group of highly trusted Burkinabe officers, led by Commander Omar himself. The commandos' routine was marked by rigorous physical and tactical training, impeccable maintenance of their equipment and constant vigilance. Their presence, although discreet, did not go unnoticed on the few occasions when they were seen in military convoys or at guard posts around the palace. The local population watched them with a mixture of curiosity, respect, and a certain fear, aware that these silent, piercing-eyed men were now their president's closest guardians. The arrival of the North Koreans posed a new and complex challenge for Western intelligence services. Monitoring their activities, understanding their chain of command, and assessing their true operational capabilities on African soil became a priority. There were also concerns that this military cooperation could extend to other areas, such as the transfer of sensitive technology or support for programs that could further increase regional instability. West Africa was once again becoming the stage for a geopolitical shadow play with global implications. The presence of North Korean commandos in Ouagadougou began to exert an almost immediate deterrent effect on potential conspirators and agents of destabilization who were surrounding Ibrahim Traoré's government. The mere news that an elite foreign force, known for its ruthless discipline and unquestioning loyalty, was now in charge of the president's personal security introduced a new level of risk and uncertainty for anyone planning a coup or assassination attempt. The aura of invincibility that some attributed to these silent warriors was in itself a powerful weapon. The coup plots, which could previously have relied on infiltrating local military units or co-opting palace guards, now faced a formidable and unpredictable obstacle. The North Korean commandos did not share the same tribal, regional, or political loyalties that could be exploited within the forces. The presence of the North Korean commandos in Ouagadougou quickly had a palpable effect, both on the internal dynamics of presidential security and on the external perception of the threats surrounding Ibrahim Traoré. The iron discipline, intensive training, and unquestioning loyalty that characterized them brought a new level of professionalism and impenetrability to the Burkinabe leaders' circle of protection. Their only loyalty was to the mission entrusted to them by their own people, a human and tactical shield that few would dare to test lightly, changing the risk calculus for any supreme command and, by extension, to the protection of the figure they had been assigned, President Traoré. This made them virtually incorruptible and immune to local intrigues, the potential aggressor's security routine. The commandos did not limit themselves to a passive presence. They actively engaged in reassessing all existing security protocols, identifying vulnerabilities and implementing new measures, with the security around the president being completely reassessed and reinforced upon the arrival of the North Koreans. They implemented protocols with a more methodical efficiency that impressed local officials. The president's travel routes were altered, the security detail tightened, using counter-surveillance techniques and personal protection that were unknown or rarely applied by security forces. At his public engagements were reinforced with additional layers of discreet surveillance and the local forces themselves. The president's every move, every meeting, every public appearance was meticulously planned and executed, with the Burkinabe Presidential Guard beginning to receive specialized training from the North Koreans in close protection tactics and a level of professionalism that impressed even the most skeptical observers. The ring of steel around Traoré counterinsurgency, raising its level of readiness. Communication between North Korean commandos and the North Koreans had become significantly thicker and more difficult to penetrate. In addition to direct protection, North Korean commandos also began to play a major role in training selected elite units of the Burkinabe armed forces. Their Burkinabe counterparts were a challenge, overcome in part by the use of carefully selected interpreters and drill instructors. They shared their close combat tactics, precision shooting techniques, and strategies in a sign language and standardized procedures that transcended language barriers. More important, however, was the mutual trust in asymmetric warfare, imparting knowledge that was not available through programs of military cooperation with Western powers that began to develop, forged in the common purpose of protecting the president and in the admiration that soldiers had for each other. This exchange, although limited and controlled, was intended to strengthen the ability of local forces to defend the locals. They were grateful for the dedication and expertise of their new partners, who demonstrated an unrelenting seriousness in their mission. For Traoré's enemies, both internal and external, the arrival of the North Country and the government against internal and external threats. Western intelligence agencies, which had previously been dealing the Koreans a significant setback. Destabilization plans that relied on flaws in the presidential security apparatus or the co-optation of elements of the local guard found themselves facing infinitely more risky and a new challenge. The North Koreans used their own encrypted communication systems, their own complex security protocols, and the mere presence of those 700 elite fighters whose reputation for ferocity and loyalty preceded them acted as a powerful deterrent, forcing the plotters to re-evaluate their strategies and, in many cases, to postpone or abandon their most audacious plans. Intelligence agencies surrounding Traoré's security had become even more opaque, adding to frustration and uncertainty in Langley. Westerners, who had previously operated with a certain freedom in Burkina Faso, have seen their activities severely restricted in Paris and other capitals. This new reality forced Traoré's enemies to reassess their strategies. Electronic surveillance became more difficult. Intelligence gathering in the field became more expert. The option of a classic military coup, quick and with little resistance, seemed increasingly ineffective, and the ability to influence events behind the scenes was drastically reduced. The North Koreans, however, were unable to do so. Any attempt to seize the presidential palace or capture the president would be met with fierce and highly resistant resistance. With their own experience in counterintelligence and in operating in hostile environments, they brought with them a new level of alertness, with the potential for bloodshed and unpredictable escalation. The cost of action and sophistication in detecting invisible threats made the environment much less permeable. The direct opposition to Traoré had increased exponentially with the arrival of his new protectors. This did not mean, however, that attempts at destabilization would cease. On the contrary, they could become more subtle, more focused on undermining popular support for Traoré, on exacerbating the country's economic difficulties. The presence of the North Korean shield gave him a margin of maneuver that he did not have before, allowing him to take bolder decisions and face external pressures more firmly, knowing that his rearguard was protected in the long term. The information war, economic sanctions, and support for radical opposition groups would continue to be supported by a loyal and highly competent force that would not bow to external influences. However, the preferred weapons, but the North Korean shield had removed the most direct and perhaps fastest option. The alliance with North Korea was not without its tensions and challenges. Cultural and ideological differences were significant, and the need to maintain secrecy and discretion around the operations of the Commandos required constant coordination and management of expectations. There was also constant concern about the reaction of the international community and the risk of even greater isolation if the North Korean presence was perceived as a threat to regional stability or as a sign of total alignment with Pyongyang. Traoré navigated these turbulent waters with remarkable diplomatic skill. balancing the need to ensure his own security with the imperative of maintaining a paradox, protecting a foreign authoritarian regime while allowing him to advance an agenda that opened few channels of communication with the rest of the world. He continued to assert that the North Korean presence was, in his view, liberating for his people. There were, of course, incidents and moments of tension. It was a temporary and defensive measure, and Burkina Faso remained a non-aligned country, seeking friendly relations and cooperation with all nations that respected its sovereignty and interests, a fine line, although never officially confirmed. Cultural adaptation and the language barrier also posed challenges but difficult to sustain. The presence of the Commandos also had a psychological impact on the Burkinabe population. For the discipline and professionalism of both sides, under the close supervision of the liaison officers, helped some. It was a symbol of the president's determination to protect the country at any cost, a demonstration of strength to quell these problems. The priority was the mission, to protect the president at all costs. The unlikely alliance between the African nationalist leader and the Asian communist warriors continued to intrigue the world, defying categories of easy westernizations and simplistic analyses. It was a testament to the complexity of modern geopolitics, where the unlikely alliance between Burkina Faso and North Korea, forged by necessity and cemented by the threat that national interests and the quest for survival can lead to partnerships that defy ideological logic or common ground, has become a fascinating case study in the dynamics of geopolitics in a multipolar world. For Ibrahim Traoré, the North Korean commandos were not just guards. They were a symbol of their determination not to bow down, to seek protection wherever it could be found, to continue their struggle for a truly independent and sovereign Burkina Faso. It demonstrated that smaller nations, when faced with unsustainable pressures, can seek unconventional solutions and form surprising partnerships to ensure their survival and assert their autonomy, defying the expectations and narratives imposed by major powers and rewriting the rules of the international game. The presence of the North Korean shield around Ibrahim Traoré not only altered the dynamics of internal security in Burkina Faso, but also sent shockwaves through the complex web of alliances and rivalries in West Africa and across the continent. Leaders of neighboring nations, many of whom also faced pressure from external powers or threats of internal destabilization, watched the situation with a mix of cautious admiration, concern, and growing strategic interest, weighing the implications for their own security and sovereignty. Some African leaders, especially those who shared Traoré's view of the need for greater autonomy from the West and stronger resistance to neo-colonialism, saw the alliance with North Korea as an act of courage and a demonstration that alternative security options could be sought outside the traditional blocs. For them, Traoré's decision, while risky, was a sign that Africa was beginning to assert itself on the global stage, willing to take unconventional measures to protect its interests and its elected leaders. Secret delegations from other African countries began to seek discreet contacts with the Burkina Faso government, interested in understanding better the terms of cooperation with Pyongyang and exploring the possibility of similar arrangements for their own security needs. The idea of having a highly skilled, loyal, and immune to local or external influences was appealing to many leaders who felt vulnerable to coups or assassination attempts orchestrated by internal enemies or sponsored by foreign powers. However, this rapprochement also generated tensions within regional organizations such as ECOWAS, Economic Community of West African States, and the African Union. Countries more aligned with the West, or those that feared the expansion of North Korean influence on the continent, expressed concern about the presence of the Commandos in Burkina Faso, arguing that it could increase regional instability, undermine efforts at security cooperation, and set a bad example for other nations. The debate over national sovereignty versus collective security and extra-regional alliances became more heated. Western powers, especially France and the United States, which have traditionally exercised a strong influence over West African security, viewed the alliance between Traoré and Pyongyang as a direct threat to their interests and their ability to project power in the region. They stepped up diplomatic pressure on Burkina Faso's neighbors to isolate the Traoré regime and condemn the North Korean presence, using arguments about human rights, arms proliferation, and the risk of regional destabilization. North Korea, for its part, saw its presence in Burkina Faso as a golden opportunity to break its international isolation and to demonstrate its ability to be a reliable security partner for nations seeking alternatives to the West. Pyongyang used the mission in Ouagadougou as a showcase for its special forces, hoping that this would open doors to new military and economic cooperation with other countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, strengthening its position on the global stage. For President Traoré, managing these complex regional and international dynamics was a constant challenge. He had to balance the need to maintain the support of his African allies, calm the concerns of his neighbors, and resist pressure from Western powers without compromising the security that the North Korean presence provided him. His diplomacy became a juggling act, seeking to build bridges where possible, but without giving up his sovereignty and strategic choices. He argued in regional forums that the decision to seek support from North Korea had been taken in a context of existential threats and abandonment by its traditional partners, who not only failed to guarantee its security, but who, in many cases, were themselves the fomenters of instability. He called on his African counterparts to show greater solidarity and to reflect on the need to build their own security mechanisms, less dependent on external actors whose interests did not always coincide with those of the continent. The presence of North Korean commandos in Burkina Faso also had an unexpected impact on the morale and perception of the armed forces of other countries in the region. The idea that an African country could train and equip its forces with the support of a non-Western nation, achieving a high level of professionalism and effectiveness, inspired some and worried others. It challenged the notion that military cooperation with the West was the only way to modernize and strengthen African defense capabilities. The alliance between Traoré and Pyongyang, then, was not just a bilateral issue. It had become a catalyst for broader debates about the future of security in Africa, the role of external powers on the continent, and the quest for genuine strategic autonomy by African nations. The North Korean shield around Traoré was a powerful symbol of this new and complex dynamic, a reminder that the world was changing and that Africa was at the center of this transformation, with leaders willing to make bold decisions and redefine the rules of the geopolitical game. While the outside world debated and analyzed the implications of Burkina Faso's surprising alliance with North Korea, inside the presidential palace in Ouagadougou, the presence of the 700 North Korean commandos became a daily routine, a new normal for President Ibrahim Traoré and his inner circle. The impeccable discipline, absolute discretion, and constant readiness of these silent warriors became a comforting constant in an environment that had for so long been marked by uncertainty and fear of betrayal and imminent attacks. Communication between the president and the commander of the North Korean contingent, a high-ranking officer known only by the code name Dragon, was regular but always formal and focused on the practical aspects of security. Cultural and language barriers, although present, were overcome by the clarity of the mission and the professionalism of both parties. Dragon reported directly to Traoré or to his security chief, Commander Omar, ensuring a short and efficient line of command, crucial in crisis situations. The North Korean commandos did not get involved in internal politics or express opinions on the decisions of the Burkinabe government, remaining strictly focused on their task of protection. Their presence was almost invisible to the general public, except for the occasional glimpse of their uniforms in presidential convoys or at discreet guard posts. They moved with the efficiency of shadows, their impassive faces rarely betraying any emotion, dedicated exclusively to the safety of the man entrusted to them. For Traoré, this impersonal, professional loyalty was a welcome contrast to the complex power dynamics and fluid loyalties that often characterized political and military circles in his own country. With the North Koreans, there was no need to worry about hidden ambitions, internal rivalries, or the possibility of co-optation by outside interests. His dedication was to the mission, and that mission was to keep him alive and safe while allowing him to rule. This new layer of security allowed the Burkinabe president to focus more intently on his reform agenda and his efforts to consolidate national sovereignty. He could travel around the country with greater confidence, meet with community leaders in remote areas, and make difficult decisions without the constant fear that his life was at risk at every turn. The North Korean shield was not just physical, it was also psychological, providing him with a peace of mind he had not known in the turbulent early years of his rule. However, the presence of such a unique foreign force on national soil was not without its challenges and complexities. There was a constant need to manage public perception and avoid any incidents that could be exploited by opponents to inflame nationalist sentiment against the presence of mercenaries or a foreign Praetorian Guard. Traoré's government actively worked to frame the North Korean presence as a cooperation between sovereign nations, based on mutual respect and the need to defend against external threats. The logistics of supporting 700 men from such a different culture, with their own unique dietary requirements and habits, also posed a challenge, although the North Koreans were known for their frugality and adaptability. Discrete supply channels were established, and considerable effort was made to ensure that their living conditions were adequate, albeit Spartan, as was their custom, to maintain optimal morale and efficiency. Cultural exchange, though limited, began to occur in subtle ways. Some Burkinabe soldiers who worked closely with the Commandos began to learn a few words of Korean, and the North Koreans, in turn, showed a discreet curiosity about the local culture, although they rarely participated in social activities outside their closed circle. These were two worlds touching, united by a common purpose, but maintaining their distinct identities, a functional and respectful coexistence. The greatest proof of the effectiveness of the North Korean shield came not through direct confrontation, but through its absence. Coup attempts, once a constant threat, became rare, almost non-existent. Assassination plots that had been brewing behind the scenes seemed to have been stifled by the mere presence and reputation of the Commandos. Traoré's enemies, aware of the new reality, opted for long-term attrition strategies like economic warfare and disinformation, rather than risk a direct confrontation with such a formidable force. President Ibrahim Traoré therefore ruled under the protection of an unlikely shield, an alliance forged in necessity and geopolitics, which allowed him to pursue his vision for Burkina Faso. The presence of the North Korean Commandos was a silent testament to his determination not to bow to pressure, to seek unconventional solutions to ensure his survival and the sovereignty of his country, and to continue to defy the expectations of a world that was still struggling to comprehend the complexity and audacity of his leadership. The unprecedented alliance between Burkina Faso and North Korea, embodied in the presence of the 700 Commandos in Ouagadougou, has not only ensured the immediate safety of President Ibrahim Traoré, but has also begun to shape in subtle but significant ways the political and strategic future of the African nation and the perception of its leadership on the international stage. What was initially an emergency measure, a desperate response to existential threats, has evolved into a complex partnership with far-reaching implications that go beyond simple personal protection. With internal stability relatively assured by the deterrent presence of North Korean commandos, President Traoré was able to devote himself more vigorously to implementing his development and sovereignty agenda. Infrastructure projects, food self-sufficiency programs, and education and health initiatives which had previously been at risk of being interrupted by political instability gained new momentum. The message to the population was clear. The government was working, and the security provided by new allies meant that the fruits of that labor were beginning to be reaped. Cooperation with North Korea, while initially focused on security, has quietly begun to expand into other areas. Technical delegations from Pyongyang have visited Burkina Faso to explore possibilities for collaboration in sectors such as agriculture, construction, and even certain niches of the military industry, where North Korea has particular expertise. especially in low-cost, high-resilience technologies suited to the conditions of developing countries seeking greater autonomy. This rapprochement, however, was carefully managed by Traoré so as not to turn Burkina Faso into a mere satellite of Pyongyang, or to completely alienate other potential partners. He continued to pursue a diversified foreign policy, keeping channels of dialogue open with nations of different ideological blocs, including some Western powers that, despite criticism, recognized the strategic importance of not completely losing communication with such an influential leader in the region. The Traoré model, as it began to be called in some academic and diplomatic circles, represented a new form of assertive pragmatism on the part of African leaders. It demonstrated that it was possible to resist hegemonic pressures, seek unconventional alliances to ensure security, and at the same time implement a development agenda focused on national interests without submitting to the dictates of international financial institutions or former colonial powers. It was a risky model, but one that inspired others. The fear that Ibrahim Traoré inspired in certain Western capitals did not diminish, but rather transformed. It was no longer just the fear of an unpredictable nationalist leader, but the fear of a precedent, of a domino effect where other African nations, rich in resources and tired of exploitation, could follow Burkina Faso's example, seeking greater sovereignty and diversifying their security and development partnerships, which could significantly reconfigure the balance of power on the continent. The presence of the North Korean Commandos thus became an enduring symbol of this new stance. They were not just guards. They were the embodiment of Traoré's determination to protect his sovereignty at all costs, a constant reminder to the world that Burkina Faso would no longer be a pawn in someone else's game. Their quiet discipline and loyalty contrasted with the intrigues and betrayals that marked much of Africa's post-colonial political history, offering an image of stability and strength. Over time, the image of North Korean soldiers on African soil, once shocking and controversial, began to be normalized, at least in certain contexts. They became part of the Ouagadougou landscape, an exotic but accepted element of the city's complex political tapestry. The local population, while still curious, grew accustomed to their discreet presence, seeing them as the protectors of a leader who, for many, represented hope for a better, more independent future. The legacy of this unlikely alliance would be debated by historians and analysts for many years to come. Was it an act of desperation or a geopolitical masterstroke? Did it strengthen Burkina Faso's sovereignty or merely trade one dependency for another? The answers, as always in history, would be complex and multifaceted. But one thing was undeniable. Ibrahim Traoré, with the help of his unlikely allies in the East, had managed to survive, consolidate his power, and defy the world. And so the story of the 700 North Korean commandos who came to protect an African leader became yet another legend in the continent's rich and often tragic history, a tale of courage, survival, unexpected alliances, and the relentless pursuit of dignity and self-determination in a world that does not always play fair. It was the story of an unlikely shield that allowed a man and a nation to dream of a different future against all odds. With this sixth installment, we conclude the narrative of North Korea sends 700 commandos to shield Traoré, exploring the implications and unfolding of this surprising alliance. I hope the depth and pace of the story have lived up to your expectations. If this saga of power, intrigue, and unexpected alliances has captivated you, and if you enjoy stories that delve into the complexities of geopolitics and the resilience of leaders who challenge the status quo, be sure to subscribe to our channel. Your support is essential for us to continue bringing impactful narratives. Please leave a like if the story caught your attention and share your thoughts in the comments. What was the most surprising moment or most important lesson you learned from this journey? We really appreciate you following along.